It's almost as if, as a side note, young people, biologically, and you could say spiritually wired to need things that only biological mom and biological dad can provide.
If you've ever wondered if there's hope for the hopeless, for those who have lived in real abuse, experienced the depths of fear, rejected the path of purity, only to wind up in a pattern of maliciousness and rage, well, you're in good company. I've invited an expert in this area, Jeremy Smith, founder of Rethink 315, back on the show, only this time not to talk about his ministry, but rather to speak on the oft of the most sensitive topics, his own personal journey from the perils of poor choices to the possibilities of redemption. Can't wait for you to listen in. I'm Dr. Nate Sala, and this is A Call to Leadership. Jeremy Smith, so good to have you back on the show.
Nate, here we are again.
Here we are. Welcome, man.
Thanks.
Well, last time we spoke, we had an interesting conversation around the concept of certainty addiction, which is super cool. And if you're a listener and you haven't heard that, we'll put that episode in the show notes. It was a broad conversation around the idea of certainty. And I won't go into that. But what we didn't go into was something really important, especially you in ministry and me in ministry as well, maybe a different branch of ministry, right?
Sure.
Is how we got here. There's such a special place in the backstory of the life we lived that led us to the life we lead today. There's aspects of it that are pretty juicy, especially you and I having some cross relationships in the club scene in the 90s and early 2000s.
We're dating ourselves now.
It's an important part of the conversation because the formation, individual formation, where we were, where we are today, it's super cool. And especially in light of the moral landscape, moral fiber, the moral compass. And I say that because, and you know this, morality in the United States especially is in decline. And it's not just me saying that. Lots of research, studies. In fact, I've got some here. Morality in the United States, many studies, a Gallup poll, 2020, Americans says approval of moral values and principles has hit an all-time low. The poll found that only 9% of Americans believe that morality in the country is excellent or good, while 77% rate it as either only fair or poor. Staggering. 2016 Pew Research found that fewer Americans today prioritize having children, getting married, living in a religious life than they did 20 years ago. For example, just 46% of adults today say that being a parent is one of the most important things in life, compared to 59% who said that in 1997. So many studies. I won't go through all of these studies, but perhaps I'll touch on a few of them. And so in the 90s, another Pew Research said 2017, fewer than half of adults in the U.S. now belong to a religious institution compared to 69% in the 1990s. It's difficult to assess specific measurements on moral decline, right? But these are studies that suggest that there's some broad changes in societal attitudes regarding the characteristics over the last 50 years that I think are relevant for a discussion around morality. But before we go there, we need to start at our own moral compasses, how they evolved. There was a time in my life where I was not necessarily amoral, but I was certainly immoral. And they were very formative years of my life, my early 20s, where I had a desire to simply be without having any authority in my life. My parents were divorced when I was young, just a little backstory. And so I lived with my mom. My dad wasn't present for a number of reasons, child support and things like that. And my mom ended up moving out of the Chicagoland area. And so I didn't have much contact with my dad. So the male figure was absent. My mom did remarry when I was about 9 years old. So I did have a stepdad who was important in my life for several years until she was divorced again. And we went and lived overseas. My parents are immigrants, and we went back to Jerusalem. And so I saw a lot of the pain and the struggle and the trials and the lack of dignity that was happening during a war-torn time in the 80s in that region.
Wow.
So again, more sort of focus on, well, you know, authority doesn't really work. This was my worldview as it was developing. You had to fend for yourself. Who's going to take care of you anyway? So these were some of the beliefs, some of the principles that I was developing, because morality is a set of principles, right? It's a set of beliefs. In fact, here's the definition, because I think we need to define it. Morality can be defined as a set of principles or values that guide an individual's conduct, decision-making, and worldview. It refers to a system of beliefs or ideas about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what is just, what is unjust, what is fair, and what is unfair. It's a foundation.
Yep.
For ethical behavior. It shapes our people, how we perceive our responsibilities, not only to ourselves, but to others and to society at large. So it's a big deal.
It is.
It's a big deal. So I grew up in that, and you can probably put together the pieces, right? No real deep mentorship. By the time I was a teen in my early 20s, man, I was off the rails. I was just, you'd say, Nate, I couldn't recognize you. You're a different person. We'll talk about the reason for all that later. Mm-hmm. How about you? What were some of the formative years? What did that look like for you?
I have so many thoughts swirling around in my head. First, let me identify some of the parallels. Our stories are very similar. I grew up without my biological dad nearby. I didn't even know who he was until I was 15. I thought a different guy was my dad, but it didn't matter that much because my mom and that guy got divorced when I was like 2. And there was this sweet season, I think, between 2 and preschool where it was just me and my mom. And I have vague memories of how happy that was and fun that was. And I'm not sure of all the details, but my mom remarried, and essentially I woke up in a strange house with a new stepdad who was like the kind of guy that gives the boogeyman nightmares.
Wow.
Right? Like, imagine the last guy on earth that you would want your daughter to marry, or your niece, or your wife even, right? Were she your daughter? This guy was abusive in just about every way you could imagine, and very intelligent, but maliciously intelligent. And he abused my mom in ways that I don't even like to talk about. I mean, he wasn't especially nice to me, but I managed to avoid the brunt of the physical abuse, but the mental and even like maybe covert spiritual abuse was pretty heavy.
Wait, how old were you?
So it was around preschool.
Wow. When
my mom married that guy. And I mean, within just a couple of months, he started showing his true colors. And by the way, my mom, she's not here anymore. She's with Jesus now. And I'm very thankful for that in some ways, as much as I miss her. She has a long backstory, a lot of unfair circumstances, and then, of course, some bad choices too. We'll get into that later. Yeah. But my point in bringing all that up is just to say I was essentially raised by a single mom with this short but impactful season with this very abusive guy, whereas it was already hard to accept authority, right? Like, and this is, later on in life, right? As I got older. As a kid, I actually wanted authority. I wanted those guardrails. I wanted safety. I wanted a male presence. But the male presence I got was terrifying. And he was mean to my mom in ways that, again, I don't even like to talk about. And I could hear a lot of this as a kid.
Yeah. Is that the feeling you would place as a primary feeling, terrified? Do you remember how you felt?
Fear. Oh, yes.
Just straight fear.
Yes. No question about it. I was scared of this guy. I don't want to fast forward too quickly, but in some ways, that's why I found refuge in things like BMX, things like skateboarding, which I still do to this day. And nice. I have all the knee injuries and back problems to prove it. And I was always really attracted to these various subcultures and sort of rebellious, like outsider type communities. Right. And we'll talk more about that, I bet. But all that to say, I lived under the thumb of this very abusive guy for, it was kindergarten or maybe pre-K, close to kindergarten or pre-K, all the way through 7th grade. So it was not a long amount of time in the grand scheme of things. I'm 44 now, but it was a significant amount of time as a young person. And those were very formative years. So that shaped me in ways that I still am very aware of today. And lots of counselors have helped me through this, by the way, and prayer and friends, right? And my wife. But like you, I didn't trust authority. I didn't feel safe at all. And I was a kid too that, very extroverted. I love ideas. I love people. I love to argue and debate. And of course, when I became a teenager, I became a professional debater, right?
Oh, yeah.
With every adult that I encountered. And so, I stood out like a sore thumb at school. And at the time thought that it was funny and that it was that even negative attention was better than no attention. Mm-hmm. And because I didn't have a lot of interactions with my stepdad or even my mom, because I was as far away from the house as I could possibly be all the time. On my bike, on my skateboard, climbing trees, going into the wood, like whatever I could do, right? Anyway, all that to say, when they divorced, my moral compass had already been kind of like hit or miss. I was mischievous, right? Yeah. As a kid, I don't remember being malicious.
Yeah.
I remember, maybe you felt the same way.
Same way. Yeah, it's an interesting relationship. So one, I want to just pause because you'd mentioned something that is important for the conversation, and I think it's important for the listener, especially from a leadership perspective. You mentioned authority and safety. Mm-hmm. So some sociologists make the argument, and I tend to agree, that there's an unwritten contract when it comes to authority figures in our lives, whether they be an individual, whether they be an institution, whether they be a government. The unwritten contract, it's an exchange. Authority for obedience. And the authority obedience exchange is an exchange for safety. So in other words, I provide authority, you relinquish your autonomy. In other words, you become obedient, and I offer safety. So safety in exchange for obedience with the authority relationship. And once that's broken, once the contract is broken, once I no longer feel safe, then I naturally no longer am required, at least in my own mind, in my own behavior, to honor the obedience part because you've broken your part. And so this is a very common experience that we find. And that's what happened to you. Mm-hmm. I don't feel safe. So why should I be obedient to your authority? Because the contract is broken.
Yes.
It's so important to understand this in relationships, in families, in communities, in businesses, right? This is a natural psychological experience. So if we are not focused on creating safe spaces for our followers, then we are naturally breaking the agreement for obedience. So this is what's happened in your life, and it was happening in mine. It doesn't make us, quote unquote, and I'm going to use air quotes, bad kids where you said maliciousness. I was not malicious, just like you weren't malicious. We just got into trouble. I'll give you an example of this. So when I was, I don't remember, maybe about 13, 14 years old, I was riding my bike with my cousin, and we were in a town called Aurora, Illinois, which is outside of Chicago. Yeah.
Very familiar.
That,
I went to high school in Joliet.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah. Small. It is a small world, right?
It is indeed.
So we're riding our bikes, and we went and just hung out. We were hanging out at a park, and there was a kid who was probably about 10 or 11 was riding his bike. And my cousin said, "Hey, kid, let me see your bike." And he said, he got off his bike, and he looked a little scared. He says, "I like your bike better than mine. I think I'm going to keep it." And the kid naturally starts crying. "No, please don't take my bike." And I looked at him, and I looked at my cousin. I said, "You're not taking his bike. Give him his bike back." I was going to fight my cousin because he was being malicious. Mm-hmm. You can get into trouble and do dumb stuff.
Sure.
We'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
But that's truly malicious.
Yes.
And so I didn't want that little kid to be hurt. Part of the reason was because on the west side of Chicago, when I was about his age, my bike got stolen.
Right.
Right? And I remember that feeling.
Right.
I could identify. I could empathize.
Sure.
And I think even though we go through some very traumatic experiences in life, in some ways, those traumatic experiences can help us to have empathy. Mm-hmm. Someone else is struggling in that same area, right? Yeah. Even through all the turmoil, the conflict. And I love the way you draw the connections with the subcultures, the rebelliousness, right?
Yeah.
We sought rebellion in part, at least I can speak for myself and I'd love to hear your perspective, to create some safe spaces, right?
Sure.
Like, okay, you know what? This is a community that gets me because we're a bunch of people who are on the fringe. We've experienced some similar traumatic experiences. We get each other. It's an interesting sort of step in the direction. So how old were you when your mom and your stepdad were divorced?
Yeah, so I was 12. I was in 7th grade on my way to 8th grade. Yeah. And what's interesting about what you said is while I wasn't a malicious kid up to that point, and while I did have context for empathy, I've been on both sides, right? I've been bullied and the bully. More bullied as a younger person, more feeling powerless and fearful. But unlike you, I think, and I don't know the rest of your story, but I want to hear it. Unlike you, once my mom divorced that guy, I mean, all bets were off for me. I went to live with my uncle for over a summer because my mom had something close to a breakdown. My mom actually was planning to kill herself. It's a heavy conversation, but a friend of hers talked her out of it. But from my point of view, one night mom was there, everything was relatively normal, and the next day I get called out of school to go back home because there's an emergency. I have no idea what's going on. And my stepdad, who rarely talked to me, he was home. I was like, what is going on? He's like, where's your mom? I don't know. Are you lying? No, I really don't know. What happened? I don't know either. She didn't come home from work last night. And so it was another few weeks before I even knew what happened to my mom. I mean, part of me wondered if he killed her because he had threatened to kill her numerous times. I mean, I had even heard this myself. The reason I bring that up is I stayed with my uncle for a summer and I concluded that I was alone. Like, my mom's gone. All my uncle would tell me was, your mom's very unhealthy, and until she gets healthy, you're staying with us. And it was open-ended. He didn't say for a few weeks or for a few months. As a matter of fact, he alluded to the possibility that I might live there until I graduate high school. I was terrified. But I grew up, within days, I think. Childhood gone. This young 12, almost 13-year-old kid now feels like there's not an adult in this world that I can count on. I barely know my uncle. And by the way, God bless my uncle, right? He was a really awesome guy for taking me in. And my little cousins, they had a healthy family, but for me, it was like, oh, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Like, I don't belong here.
Right.
I don't belong here. I never felt like I was accepted. And I ended up back in my mother's care, but she wasn't the same mom. It's really sad. Abuse, mental health issues, brokenness, regret, depression, that does things to people. So I kind of lost my mom. Even though she didn't take her own life, I did lose her in a sense. And there were still great things about her, and there were, redeeming qualities. But I say all that to say, because this conversation about morality is critical to every human that's ever lived or ever will live. And that definition's interesting too. We can get into that later. But while I wasn't malicious as a kid, I think a really strong moral compass. I didn't even grow up in a Christian home per se. My mother was a professing Christian, but we weren't going to church. We were maybe Easter, maybe Christmas kind of people, right? Anyway, I concluded at a young age, probably about 9, 10, that my prayers weren't making it past the ceiling. Because I prayed for my mom to be rescued from this monster. I don't remember exactly when, but at one point I said, you know what? Maybe God's real. Maybe Jesus is his son. Yeah, he's got a tan. He does magic. He wants to live in my chest. I don't care. I don't want anything to do with this God or his son because I've asked him for help. He didn't give it to me. And it wasn't even selfish. It wasn't a selfish request. I didn't ask for that new GT Pro Performer, the bike, right? I asked for my mom to be safe from someone who was hurting her. And the answer was silence. And things didn't get better, they got worse. So while I was a decent kid, I was mischievous, not malicious. I think I took the other door than you did, because I was empathetic in a sense, and yet I started squashing those emotions. I stopped feeling on purpose. I think everybody has two choices, people particularly that have been through serious trauma. Well, three choices, actually. One is you're fearful, you retreat, you withdraw, you go very inward, right? And then another is a healthier response. I think, like you said, like you get the help that you need, and you establish this concept of empathy now makes a lot more sense, and you actually can become a healer, right? You were wounded, but now you're a healer, right? And you know how to heal those wounds. So none of that was really going on in my head as a kid. Mine was more primal. And this is actually why I love this question about morality, because without really thinking about it, I just went the might makes right route. I said, if I'm afraid of the monsters, I can't beat the monsters. Well, perhaps I'll become the monster. And empathy, well, that's a useless emotion. While I feel it, I'm going to learn how to silence it.
Yeah.
And I really went in the opposite direction. I mean, my behavior evolved from mischievous to malicious in just a short 2, maybe 3 year period.
Wow. In your early teens.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
13 is when I concluded, no, actually, yes, there is a God. No, he does not care about my mom and I. The contract had been broken. I'm glad you brought that up. As far as I could tell, right? I didn't know what I didn't know. As far as I could tell, contract had been broken. I cannot rely on your authority. And I remember telling someone in my family who was a Christian, trying to like tell me to ask Jesus to live in my chest or something. And I'm like, why would I want to be a slave to a God who doesn't care about me and my mom? And what I mean by slave is, again, the social contract. He wants me to obey. But what for? Like, why would I want to say yes to a bunch of arbitrary rules enforced by a distant God who doesn't care about me and my mom? I'm not going to obey. He's not keeping his end of the bargain. I'm not going to keep my end of the bargain. Deal's off, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm 44 now. I certainly wasn't as self-aware then. I mean, I think it was pure instinct. You could say maybe even like an evolutionary mechanism for survival and self-protection. I had never read Nietzsche. I had no idea what an Übermensch was, right? And we can get into that. This is pre-Columbine. This is pre-internet, right? I didn't know much about much, but I knew this. Morality is for losers. Actually, better yet, it's for fools. It's a sucker's game. I've seen through the system, right? Even before the Matrix. But in my head, I'm just like, why obey? I can make my own rules. I can be my own authority. I can be my own God. I didn't say that with my mouth, but that's what was going on in my heart. And might makes right. If I can get it done through fear, intimidation, or in my case, because I'm not a very big guy, through manipulation, then the ends justifies the means. And that landed me in prison, by the way. Or maybe you didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
We'll talk more.
Yeah.
But this is a heavy topic. And I know a lot of young people come to these same conclusions, right?
Someone listening right now, maybe in that place, right now, where you were, right now at this very moment, like, hey, I can invent my own security. Nobody else is going to do it for me.
That's right.
Whether it's on earth or in heaven. This is a place that people, I suspect, not just younger, I mean, people at any stage of the journey. Such a powerful story in your journey, and almost with goosebumps, because some variances and some tangents in us. However, one that was spot on, even to the point where it was almost an identical story, was you'd mentioned living with your uncle for a summer. I lived with my uncle for a summer.
Really? How old were you? Oh, 14. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's close.
My mom had her first nervous breakdown. And she moved overseas. I stayed with my uncle. The growing up, those moments, and I said, she got some medical help. Turns out that she had bipolar. And then she decided she was going to go live overseas, and I didn't want to go. And my brother and my sister went. And
she gave you a choice, though?
She gave me a choice. It was more of, I'm not leaving. I'm done. Either I don't go or I go find another place to live and nobody finds out. Kind of the same thing that you're going through, right? You're like, look, I'm just going to invent my own future that I feel is safe and secure for me. I mean, we came from a religious background. So I had, interestingly, it was
Islam,
it was
right?
Muslim, yes, Islamic background. So I had practices, very disciplined in a lot of aspects of certain conditions of morality. However, my view of authority was, as you said, I'm just going to take matters into my own hands. And then my mom says, well, why don't you go live with your dad? And I said, okay, I'll go live with my dad. My dad lived in Chicago still, which is where I'm from. But
you didn't know him that well, right?
Yeah, I would just see him like once a week, a year.
Yeah.
So I was angry. As you and I were about the same stature, I was a fighter. I was actually a physical fighter. So I looked for fights and altercations. I didn't care how big they were. If I got beat up, I got beat up. And I just didn't like bullies. And the old Avengers, Captain America, do you want to go kill Nazis? He says, no, I just don't like bullies, right? That resonates with me.
Right.
And so anytime I encountered a bully, whether it was in a classroom, I'm like, let's just fight. Let's just take it out. After class is over, we'll just handle it out there. And sometimes I'd leave with a black eye. Sometimes I'd leave with a busted lip. Sometimes I'd get a few shots in. But this was I would fight fights for my friends.
Yep.
I'd say, you know what? Let me fight him. He's got an issue with you and your girlfriend. I'll take care of it. Of course, sometimes
pinch hitter.
I wouldn't always work in my favor. In fact, one fight, we were in Chicago, and this guy who had an issue with one of my buddies, we were on the corner of a street called 22nd, which is Cermak in Cicero, a town called Cicero on the west side of Chicago. And we're fighting, and this guy was a wrestler, and he puts me in this wrestling hold. What are you doing? This is unfair, illegal move. I'm like, you got to let me out of this move so we can fight.
Right.
He's like, I'm not letting you out of this move. We ended up becoming friends. That's how usually guys end up. You have a fight, and then you become buddies.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah, that happens a lot.
Yeah. So my dad, God bless him, man. He has no experience in parenting. He inherits an angry, rebellious young man who is in some ways just off the rails. And
reckless.
I look back and I'm like, boy, I feel so bad, right? My dad's no longer with us as well. And he's trying to understand, but I'm like, look, I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And the smallest infraction that I thought was impeding on my freedom, I just go nuts. And my dad's like, he never raised his voice at me, never laid a hand on me. He was very conscious of my lack of, as you said, awareness, right? Self-awareness at the time. And interestingly, my grades in 8th grade were fantastic. I had straight A's. And then 9th grade, when all of my mom and my former stepdad were still together, and they break up, she has her nervous breakdown. And then grades go in the tank, relationships go in the tank. Just the entire fabric of my foundation crumbled.
It's almost as if, as a side note, young people biologically, and you could say spiritually wired to need things that only biological mom and biological dad can provide. I don't know why that's a controversial statement in some places, but it seems to me that's the case.
That is 100% the case. Man, Jeremy, I wanted to be with my dad, like my dad. And I loved my stepdad. He was a good stepdad. Unlike your situation, he provided. He was caring and loving, but he wasn't the person who I wanted to model and emulate. I wanted to walk like my dad. I wanted to eat like my dad. I wanted to sound like my dad. It wasn't anything, by the way, this may be different for some people, but it wasn't anything that someone had to tell me either. Like, you should. It was just like, I longed for that connection.
Yeah.
And it was missing. And so there was a break. There was a true break in the possibilities in my own mind that I would ever live a life that had harmony. And so as we progress into these teen years, you get into high school, of course. Now, where are you at the time?
Yeah, for me, part of 8th grade, uncle. And then my mom came back to get me after my uncle essentially said, I can't handle him. And it's interesting because while I'm more of a talker and a lover than a fighter, I was a lot like you in that I did pick a lot of fights. And I probably lost more than I won. Actually, my mouth got me into more fights than machoism, right? Or even my sense of morality or justice, which sounds like motivated you a lot.
With a hothead.
Yeah, but I was a hothead too. Yeah. But what ended up happening was I learned how to make friends with the toughest kids. I learned how to gain the respect of my friends' older brothers. I created for myself a posse or a family, and I moved a lot too. I mean, I counted it up from my testimony. I can't remember the exact number, but it's in the high teens.
That you moved.
I had moved, yeah, a lot. I was always the new kid at school. Always. And even while my mom was married to that stepdad that I had mentioned, there were nights where she's like, okay, we're leaving. Pack your bags. We're out. Middle of the night, right? Like, grab just a few things. We're going to grandma's. And that happened 2 or 3 times, and they were separated a couple of times. And there was one point where she actually left him and we started a new life somewhere. But he would always win her back with bribes, promises. None of it stuck, but my mom wanted this to work because she had 2 other kids with him too after, so I was the stepkid, but I had 2 half-brothers, which I love dearly, and yet those were his kids, not me. Anyway, sorry. So when I was back in my mother's care, we ended up living with a guy that she had met at a bar, and by God's grace, he was a nice guy. He was a recovering addict and still an alcoholic, but he was a good man. He introduced me to literature, good music, philosophy. I mean, there are a lot of things that I can say, were it not for that guy in my life for those few short years, I probably wouldn't be who I am today, right? And as broken as he was, and again, my mom wasn't the same, but it was around that time, like, so 8th grade, I towed the line, got good grades, did some stupid things, but I was cautious. 9th grade, start teeter-tottering a little bit. By my sophomore year of high school, I was doing drugs regularly, skipping school regularly.
So 15, approximately?
15, yeah, I was 15 years old. I stopped hanging out with the skateboarders, which is really sad because they were my real friends. But in that cultural moment, being a skateboarder was like social suicide. Like, I kind of grew up in the wrong era, right? Because for us, that was the rebellious thing to do. And being a rebel wasn't really cool. Like, you weren't with the jocks. You weren't with the nerds. And I don't mean these terms, by the way, in like a negative sense. I'm just labels, kid labels, right? High school labels.
Yeah. You
didn't fit in with the athletes or the smart kids and even some of the preppy cool kids. And so I did like a whole makeover. I changed my clothes, changed my vernacular. Like, I adopted new slang terms because around high school, freshman, sophomore year, I realized skaters are not dating the prettiest girls in school. I would like to date the prettiest girls in school. As a matter of fact, I'd like to do a lot more than dating. That is another part of my story, right? But I kind of said goodbye to my skater friends and became something I wasn't. It was like the first of like several times in my life where I would like adopt an identity that would benefit me. So I started hanging around with like the cool kids and started dressing like the cool kids so that I could sit at a different lunch table. But I also brought my skateboard to school, hid it in my locker, and in my book bag, I had my skateboarding shoes and an old pair of pants and a t-shirt.
Nice.
So after school, I'd go back to my old crew, and it was a love-hate thing with them because it's like, dude, You pretend like you don't know us at school, but then after school, you're skateboarding until it's dark, like the rest of us. And I think I got a pass because I was very good. Every skate park I went to or street spot I went to, there could be 20 kids there and I'd still be top 3. I was never a pro, right? In the Midwest, that's not an easy feat, right? But I was pretty good.
You can handle yourself.
I could, and I don't say that to boast, but when you do something from sun up till sundown every day for years, you get good at it.
You become proficient. Yeah.
Yep. Anyway, so this malicious streak, again, I did not read Nietzsche. I didn't even know who that was. And yet I had come to this conclusion subconsciously that there's no reason to obey. Like the social contract, altruism, fairness, it's a sucker's game. Didn't work for me, didn't work for my mom. I'm going to rise above that. And that's how I become the Ubermensch or the Superman. I'm above morality. I'm calling the shots. I'm my own God. I'm my own authority. And a lot of people actually live as if that's true. Whether they become violent or manipulative or not, they're their own lawgiver, right? There's no objective standard outside of maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain.
Right.
This is what I started doing. And I'm telling you, it didn't take long for me to silence that small voice that said, this isn't good. Don't hurt anybody. Please just tell the truth. Don't hurt yourself. That voice became like a distant memory to me because I just kept doing things, even though it's almost like watching movies, and I've never killed anybody, but you watching movies where people talk about, hey, the first one's the hardest, right?
Right.
It was like that. Yeah. Like, it wasn't easy to shoplift the first time, but by the 20th time, I was pretty darn good at it. It wasn't easy to seduce my buddy's girlfriend the first time. Felt kind of bad, but 4 or 5 occurrences of that and you feel less bad, right? And it wasn't like, it's just a snowball effect. And I really got to the point where I was fighting all the time. I'd been kicked out of 2 different schools. And I really believed, maybe you believed this too at one point, that what it meant to be a man, because I didn't have a lot of great male role models. By the way, my mom's boyfriend was a nice guy. He was a philosopher, a poet, a musician. And I loved that about him. But I didn't respect him, right? I didn't respect him at all. It wasn't until later that I grew to respect the gifts that he had given me in terms of literature and music. But my point in saying all that is just to say that, like a lot of guys that grow up without a dad, my idea of masculinity was totally shaped by my friends' stupid brothers, my stupid friends, and stupid people on like MTV, right? It's like, okay, fighting, machoism, that brand of masculinity, right? That's how you show you're a man. Womanizing, like kids nowadays call it upping your body count, right? Who knows what we called it back then, but if you had a lot of interactions
getting
with the
jiggy with
opposite
it.
Set, yeah, getting jiggy with it. So fighting, womanizing, and then the last one for me was really just saying yes to every dare. That's how I learned to survive in new schools was, like prison rules, basically. Like go in, find the biggest guy, and pick a fight with him, right? You'll gain the respect of everybody. Well, I didn't quite use that methodology, but I would go in and I would demonstrate a level of crazy that not many boys in the school could live up to. Like, oh, you want to see me grab this fire extinguisher and hose down the principal's office? Watch this. Those were the kinds of stunts that I would pull early on to try to befriend the crew, right? I had learned all too quickly that I'm not like supermodel or anything. I'm a dork. I'm a real dork.
You're a handsome guy.
Well, and as a kid,
right?
Again, around puberty is when I realized like, oh, girls like me, right? And my 14-year-old is realizing this. On the one hand, I'm like, hey, that's cool. Let's guide this. Be cautious, right? It's not a bad thing. It's a gift. But on the other hand, I'm terrified, right? I'm like, oh no, he's one of those guys. Like, what did Chris Rock say? Like, so it's a side note, but not every guy will chase it. But if it chases you, very few guys can resist, right? So that's what I'm worried about with my son. And that's how it was for me. Well, I learned how to leverage that. And when I was the new kid at school, if I didn't make friends with the boys first, I ended up becoming the target of their anger because girls liked me. So it only took a couple of like experiences to realize I have to impress the biggest kids, or at least ones with the most social capital, right? That will help me when their girlfriends like say things about me, or maybe even I date some of them, right?
Yeah.
But my behavior, again, graduated from mischievous to malicious because I realized that I didn't have to obey any rules, started fighting, started cheating, started stealing, and I ended up going to jail 3 times. As a juvenile when I was 15, I got arrested for aggravated battery because I used a weapon. So at 16, and by the way, I spent the night in juvie, got out, whatever, on probation. 16, almost to the day, a year later, I got arrested again for aggravated battery. When I was 17, and if my boy Dave's listening, I don't hate you. I love you. It's the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. At 17, my buddy and I got into it with like 8 guys. It was a terrible decision, right? Nobody's that tough. And my buddy, he's in this altercation. We're outnumbered. And I had 3 choices, right? Like, oh, well, I can run and let my friend get beat up. Or I could jump into this situation with my dukes up, 30 style boxing, and I can help him, but also like I'm going to get beat up, right? Or I can grab this aluminum Easton baseball bat that's in the back of his little baby blue Geo Metro hatchback, and I can kind of level the playing field. And I chose door number 3. I hit an 18-year-old kid in the face with a baseball bat. Almost killed him.
Boy, do I love a good cliffhanger. Well, this story is just warming up. Tune in next week to hear part 2 of Jeremy's journey from rage to redemption. I really appreciate you joining us, but you don't have to wait till next week to listen in to the show. In fact, the next episode is part of a series on power that I'm hosting during our one-on-one episodes and how to leverage it to affect meaningful change. I hope you can listen into that. I can't wait to see you again. I'm Dr. Nate Sala. This is A Call to Leadership.